the longtime stated goal of the U.S. government through successive administrations, and especially amplified now in the wake of October 7th by the Biden administration, is the two-state solution. And Biden was asked, this was a great question, by the way. Biden was asked in a sort of a scrum, is it impossible to achieve a two-state solution while Bibi Netanyahu is prime minister of Israel, given that he continues to assert that not only does he oppose a Palestinian state now and forever, he has been a primary opponent of ever getting a Palestinian state for decades at this point. Let's take a listen to what Joe Biden had to say.
Mr. President, is a two-state solution impossible if Bibi's in power? If Bibi's in power?
Is the former president trying to derail negotiations on Ukraine and the border? What do you think?
I'd ask him.
Are you going to reconsider conditions on Israel aid, given what Netanyahu said about a one-state?
I think we'll be able to work something out.
What does that mean?
There are a number of types of two-state solutions. There's a number of countries that are members of the UN that are still don't have their own militaries. A number of states that have limitations on it. And so I think there's ways in which this could work.
But Bibi has said he's opposed to any two-state solution.
He didn't say that.
So what is he open to?
I'll let you know.
Did you talk about it this morning?
So
that was interesting, actually.
Every part of that is very revealing. So let me go through it. So first of all, he's asked, do you think it's impossible with Bibi as prime minister? And he says no. He says there are a number of types of two-state solutions. He says no. He didn't say that he's totally opposed to two-state solutions. Well, he has said that multiple times and continues to say that. I'll show you in just a moment. But he lays out his specific idea of basically a Palestinian state that isn't really a state, that doesn't really have sovereignty, some sort of state minus solution that he thinks maybe he can sell to the Israelis, even with Netanyahu as prime minister. I mean, there's a lot to say about this. I mean, first of all, I think that solution is unacceptable. To give them some sort of pretend state that isn't real, number one, is unacceptable. Number two, even that Netanyahu is not going to go for. He is adamantly opposed to any form of anything approaching a Palestinian state or Palestinian sovereignty. So Biden is living in some sort of fantasy delusion, even in spite of the fact that Bibi continues to make it clear that there will never be a Palestinian state so long as he is in power.
Yeah, I mean, Krystal, he made that very, very clear in his speech. It's amazing, too, because this is the perfect example of Hebrew versus English. In English, I don't believe he's ever said it, but in Hebrew, he's now tweeted it now multiple times. He's saying it to the public. He seems to forget that some of us can actually listen in on English language broadcast that's translating his remarks live. Here's what he had to say.
For 30 years, I am very consistent, and I'm saying something very simple. This conflict is not on the lack of a state of Palestinian, but the existence of a state, the Jewish state. Every area that we evacuate, we receive terrible terror against that. It happened in South Lebanon, in Gaza, and also Judea and Samaria, which we did it. And therefore, I clarify that in any other arrangement, in the future, the state of Israel have to control on the entire area from the river to the sea. This is what happens when you have sovereignty. This truth I say to our American friends. And I also stopped the attempt to impose us a reality that will jeopardize us. A prime minister in Israel has to be able to say no, even to the best of friends. To say no when you need to and to say yes when you can.
Krystal, you were explaining to me that the river to the sea is not the perfect translation, but it's still the inspiration, if you want to just give that
because, okay, so obviously the exact phrasing from the river to the sea has been framed as genocidal when it's coming from college students on campus here, or any sort of Palestinian activists, et cetera. And then Bibi says it here, and, apparently that's fine. It's also in the Likud party charter, by the way, as it is in the Hamas charter from, when Hamas was originally founded. Now, the cope here was, he didn't actually say from the river to the sea. He said the entire area west of the River Jordan. which is literally defining the exact same territory. But that was the goal. Well, he didn't actually say from the river to the sea. He said from the river to the sea, but used like different technical words in Hebrew.
Yeah.
In any case, he's making it as clear as he possibly can. He literally says, for 30 years, I am very consistent. And he's correct.
No,
he has never hidden his disdain and disgust for the idea that there would ever be a Palestinian state. And he's making it incredibly clear here that the entire area west of the Jordan, or from the river to the sea, however you want to put it, he wants it to be under Israeli control. So makes for very awkward situation for U.S. officials who have gone out of their way. You know, they freaking censured Rashida Tlaib from saying this when she's using it to call for equal rights for everyone, whether they are Muslim, Arab, Jewish, any nationality, any religious group in that area. She's censured for it. And yet, let's take a listen to, this is D4, guys, John Kirby trying to clean this one up based on Netanyahu's comments. Let's take a listen.
Did the president address Netanyahu's use of the phrase from the river to the sea in their conversation today? I know the White House has previously said that phrase is divisive. So
I'm not aware that that specific phrase was discussed.
do you condemn him using that phrase?
Look, there's a connotation with that phrase. We've talked about this before, but when you use the phrase "river to the sea," it speaks basically to the mantra of Hamas and in their manifesto, where they basically describe the geographic bounds of what they believe to be Palestine. And if you look at it on the map, if you go look at the four corners that they describe it, it's basically the state of Israel. They just don't believe it should exist. So again, it's not a phrase that that we recommend using, given because of that context.
But this wasn't Hamas. This was Netanyahu.
I understand. I don't have anything more on that, and I certainly don't have anything more on the conversation to read out with respect to that.
But this wasn't Hamas. This was Netanyahu. And by the way, like, just again, this man is not hiding his aspirations, his ideology, what his views are. Before any of this happened, he went to the UN with a map of Israel.
I remember that.
From the river to the sea, with no Palestinian, no West Bank, no Gaza Strip, no Palestinians whatsoever. That was all fine and good. And apparently Joe Biden is still operating under some delusion in which Bibi Netanyahu could be some sort of partner for an actual negotiated peace settlement. And just, Saagar, in case it wasn't totally 100% clear from the literally thousands of times he said it before, Netanyahu also tweeted out, let's put this up on the screen, this is D3, guys, I will not compromise on full Israeli security control over the entire area west of Jordan. And again, to be totally clear, he says this is contrary to a Palestinian state. So he's making it as plain as he possibly can, and yet Joe Biden still not getting the message here somehow.
Yeah, I mean, at a certain point, it's like, look, guys, like, what are we doing here? And same thing. I have a very simple proposition, which is to treat Israel like you treat every other nation. And if you treat, but the problem is that this is America. This is apparently the way that we treat our so-called allies. We're like, hey, Ukraine, we're going to give you all these weapons, but just don't use it to attack Russia. And they're like, okay, yeah, sure, we'll just use it to attack Russia. And we're like, oh, well, you probably shouldn't do that, but here's a couple more. And now we do the same thing here. The EU has a much more sensible policy. If we can put the tear sheet up there, please, D5. I was reading this just yesterday. And look, in the EU, Germany literally has laws on the books where they'll imprison you, if you protest for Palestine. And yet for them, they're like, look, we need to, quote, seek consequences for Israel over opposition to Palestinian statehood. They have urged member states now to impose basically sanctions from Brussels and from all member states if they continue to oppose Palestinian statehood. I find this to be an eminently reasonable policy, which is that, look, if you are going to go against the wishes of what we believe is a sustainable peace and or a sustainable solution, then we are not going to support you monetarily. It's very simple. That's what you usually would do in the past. This is also the fanatical way that we talk about this is deeply contrary to historical American foreign policy towards Israel. Henry Kissinger often would lecture Golda Meir, who was a hell of a lot more liberal than Netanyahu. George W. Bush would often lecture Netanyahu and the Israeli government. And in fact, you can go back and pull a transcript. I've read it here in the past, a couple of years ago, of of Ari Fleischer, who is like, they literally justified the war in Iraq. And he said, we condemn Israel attacking apartment buildings in Gaza. Like, that's how much that is how much the rhetoric and the policy has changed here. I don't really know what happened, to be honest. It seems that we've somehow gone in the opposite direction, which is kind of crazy considering what the overall situation is. But look, they've humiliated us. There's just no question. They've humiliated President Biden. The Ukrainians did too. They probably learned from Zelensky. They're like, well, look, if he could do it, what are we going to do? And they've got our political system basically rigged. So, I see these Republicans all the time who are attacking Biden for not being pro-Israel enough. I'm like, what do you want? It's like, I almost said the F word, but I'm like, what else could you possibly want? They're getting their weapons. I mean, Biden didn't even talk to him for 20 days, which in my opinion is nuts. How do you go 20-some days without talking to the person who is actively engaged in this war and is escalating and doing things that are getting us involved in a situation? At the very least, you would expect some sort of bilateral communication. Then the question is, like, are they the ones that snubbed us? And then he goes out and, gives a speech saying sometimes you have to tell your American friends, no, where's the requisite policy from our president? Yeah. Why doesn't he give a speech and be like, listen, I support the state of Israel? As we often understand, the state is different than the politician. Him and I have differences, and as long as he's going to have this policy, then the policy of the United States is going to be support what we believe is in the long-term interest of Israeli national security, which is a two-state solution. And if you have a government that's in place that believes that, then I'm sorry, we're at counter odds here. That doesn't mean I have anything against you. I'm not anti-Semitic. We have a disagreement. What's wrong with that?
Yeah.
But, we can't talk that way here.
Saagar, it is interesting to think about how we've gotten to this place, because you tell me if you think that I'm wrong with this, but Trump and then Biden have been the two most pro-Israel, total unconditional support for whatever they want to do, no criticism, we ship the weapons, we don't say a word in grievance that we've ever had. I mean, thinking back,
Trump definitely. Biden too. Yeah, I'll say Biden too. Obama actually was extremely pro-Israel until he no longer was campaigning for office. So I don't know if you remember this. In 2016, I believe it was actually during the campaign, he allowed some UN resolution to go through.
That's right.
People freaked out. But that was, frankly, the only real counter-Israel thing that he ever did.
After
you could
there
say
was
the Iran deal.
After there was no political.
Yeah, there was no political consequences.
Listen, I'm not saying that any of the other presidents were good on the issue, but Biden and Trump have taken it to a whole other level. And it is interesting because it comes at a time when the American public has moved in the opposite direction. There's a lot more skepticism of Israel, especially in the Democratic base, but also there's some rising numbers among independents and a little bit among Republicans as well. For the first time, you have some actual dissident voices in Congress. Not a lot of them, because it's still very difficult to win a campaign if you're going to have courage on this issue. But there are actually a few dissident voices who have, from the beginning, been calling for a ceasefire and been taking absolute hell for it too. So it is a strange situation where, you end up with this president who is absolutely lockstep at a time when the U.S. public is really reassessing what this relationship is, why we're supporting it, why our tax dollars are going to fund these absolute horrors and atrocities that are unfolding before our eyes.
I could see it going both ways. I could see, things wrapping up and then maybe everybody just moves on or whatever. But I've said it before. I think the biggest mistake that Bibi ever made was coming here and criticizing Obama to his face in his own country. Because it's just like, who do you think you are, man? You think the American president's going to go to the Knesset and speak against you? By the way, we should now, at this point. Yeah. After you dare to do that in our country, we always have an Israel exception, it seems to be. So I do think that in the long run, they definitely have lost it. In general, the Democratic Party, look, you can ignore it for as long as you want, but if you've got a small d Democratic consensus, I don't think things have reached the breaking point, quote unquote, yet. It will come, more likely if there is kinetic action involving U.S. troops, because that's when the debate and the fire really breaks, in general, is if U.S. military lives are actually, are really being spent and we're getting involved, and especially in a bigger war, but even a minor one, I could see things changing on the domestic side.
You bring up an important thing with the Iranian nuclear deal, because Israel did not want that deal to be signed. And so that is another really significant instance where Obama went against Israel in a way that Joe Biden certainly wouldn't have. And there's these stories, too, about Biden undermining Obama's policy vis-a-vis Israel and sucking up to Netanyahu and telling him, like, I'm the only friend you've really got here, but you can rely on me, basically. I'm paraphrasing, but that was effectively what he was saying to him. And, so listen, in a lot of areas, up till now, I would have said Biden's, certainly his domestic policy and really probably his foreign policy was better than Obama's. I mean, getting us out of Afghanistan, rolling back the drone war, those were all positive steps in the right direction. Just to completely squander it with these absolute horrors that we are backing 100% and creating tremendous risk for our service members, for global stability, just absolute insanity. And just last thing here, as a reminder, because I never want to lose sight of what continues to unfold on the ground in Gaza, an American doctor who went and worked in Al-Aqsa Hospital in Gaza came back and was interviewed by PBS NewsHour about what that experience was like. Just take a listen to what she has to say.
There is no death with dignity when you're lying on the ground of an emergency room in Gaza.
In my first 3 hours of working at Al-Aqsa Hospital, I treated a 1-year-old boy with a bloody diaper, and his right arm and right leg had been blown off. There was no leg below the diaper. He was bleeding into his chest. I treated him on the ground because there were no stretchers and no beds available. And when the orthopedic surgeon came to wrap his stumps up to stop the bleeding, I would have imagined in the US this would have been a straightforward case that went immediately to the operating room because of the severity as a stat case. And instead, the impossible choices inflicted on the doctors of Gaza have made it such that he wasn't the emergency of the day. There was a waiting list and the operating room was already full with other more pressing cases. And so I asked myself, what's more pressing than a 1-year-old without an arm, a leg, and who's bleeding into his chest and choking on his blood? And that will tell you a little bit about the scale of devastation that the people of Gaza are suffering.
Just absolutely unimaginable. I mean, this woman is a hero for going in there and doing everything that she can. But I literally cannot imagine. She says, what's more pressing than a 1-year-old without an arm and a leg who's bleeding into his chest and choking on his blood, and he's not even the top priority at that moment. And remember, this is happening to 10 kids are losing their legs every single day. We're talking cesareans with no anesthetic, amputations with no anesthetic, hospitals consistently under bombardment. You actually had Jordan just complaining to Israel, their field hospital that they set up was coming under attack. The level of devastation, the level of generational trauma. Imagine what these kids are going to deal with for their whole lives, the ones who are lucky enough to survive all of this. The horror is indescribable. Hey guys, if you like that video, go to breakingpoints.com, become a premium subscriber, and help us build the best independent media organization on the planet.
That's right. We're subscriber funded. We're building something new. We want to replace these failing mainstream media organizations.
So again, to subscribe, it's breakingpoints.com.